Okay, so thank you once again for being here, and let's get started. So if those of you who don't know, GSA was founded in 1990 by a passionate group of individuals dedicated to protecting the waters of the Strait of Georgia. When they saw all the threats it was facing, like raw sewage discharge and pulp mill pollution, their work began through a human-powered marathon across the strait to raise awareness about these issues. We're still engaged in a lot of the work we used to do in the 90s, like fighting open net fish farms and advocating for green boating practices. Uh, but we do have a new mission statement, which is as follows. Grounded in environmental justice, we mobilize and support collective action to protect the Salish Sea region. We really want to see a Salish Sea that's teeming with life, where thriving and just communities live in balance with the environment. And to achieve our mission and vision, we harness community power and connect people with place through community-led initiatives and through the three programs that we have, our Clean Marine BC, which encourages better boating practices, our brand new marine planning program, which I've already talked about, and our biodiversity program. We actually have our biodiversity campaigner, Maitili, with us today, who will be helping out with the question and answer part of this session. But Maitili, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. I'm Maithili, and I'm the biodiversity campaigner at GSA. And my role primarily entails to advocate for the biodiversity protection in the Salish Sea. And as our logo suggests, our work has also been focused on enhancing the protection of the southern resident killer whales in the region. Before we get into the specifics, I would like to acknowledge that I am calling in from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. As Kelly mentioned, I will be moderating the questions today, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your panel. And since this is also a recorded session, if you are uncomfortable with your name being displayed on the screen, you can check off the anonymous sender option, and that should take care of it. That being said, we are looking forward to having a constructive discussion on ocean noise, its impact on marine life, and the work being done around it. So, this is a gentle reminder for all of us to be mindful and respectful with our comments and questions to our wonderful panelists and to each other. We are going to get to these questions at the end of the session, like Kelly mentioned, but feel free to fill in the Q&A box as we listen to each of the panelists speak as well. We aim to get to each of the questions, but at the off chance we aren't able to due to time constraints, I will link our email in the chat. Please feel free to send us your questions. We will be happy to answer any and all questions that you have, or just send us an email to get in touch. Thank you so much for being here on a Wednesday evening. We really appreciate it. We're really excited for today's session. And over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, Maitili. Okay, so just a brief overview on what is ocean noise pollution. So this underwater soundscape is rich in sound. We can divide the sound in two ways, natural and anthropogenic. Natural sounds can be further divided into biotic sounds, which are sounds produced from wildlife like shrimp snaps, whale songs, fish grunts, and abiotic sounds, which come from non-living sources, such as waves, underwater earthquakes, and the breaking of icebergs. However, another source is beginning to alter the soundscape, called anthropogenic or human-generated noise. And these sounds come from things like ship traffic, seismic exploration, oil and gas drilling, fishing activities, infrastructure development, and more. So sound travels about 4.3 times to 5 times faster in water than in air, depending on temperature, salinity, and depth. The reason for this is simply because water is denser than air, which means its particles are much closer together. This proximity allows them to bounce off each other and transmit energy more quickly than the more widely spaced particles in air. As a result, sound retains its energy longer in water because the denser particles carry sound waves better. So sound not only travels faster underwater, but it's also more intense. And this is why ocean noise pollution is such a significant concern. Anthropogenic noise is particularly harmful to cetaceans like dolphins and whales because it disrupts their ability to echolocate. Echolocation involves is when an animal sends out sound waves that bounce back after hitting an object. These echoes are crucial for communication, navigation, and foraging, and can help these animals identify the location of other marine animals or obstacles in their surroundings. In this infographic, the decibel levels of human activities are quite high, reaching up to 260 decibels, which definitely exceed the natural sounds from marine life. Now, you may be wondering, well, snapping shrimp can make sounds as loud as 200 decibels. Isn't that noise too? Well, the key difference lies in the nature of these sounds. Snapping shrimp can produce loud noises, but these are often short-lived bursts. In contrast, anthropogenic noises from sources like seismic exploration and vessels are much more constant and longer lasting. Plus, when you have multiple sources of human noise happening at the same time, these can significantly amplify those negative impacts to the surrounding ecosystem, disrupting marine life behavior. Imagine you're in a busy cafe trying to explain a story to a friend that's sitting near you, but the cafe is full of people and loud music. So naturally, you raise your voice to explain the story. It might be fine for a few minutes, but after prolonged periods of time, this can be really exhausting. And this is an example of auditory masking, where one sound of interest is being masked by another louder sound, and this decreases an animal's ability to detect or even understand that original sound, interfering with their ability to communicate with each other. For southern resident killer whales, prolonged exposure to auditory masking can lead to chronic stress and alter their daily behaviors as they struggle to detect vital sounds in their environment. For these creatures, sound is everything, but it is being drowned out by human noise. The Trans Mountain Pipeline has increased vessel traffic by 900% within the critical habitat of southern residents, which is their primary foraging grounds. A study showed that southern residents lose up to 5.5 hours of foraging time, which is, sorry. Noise pollution also affects other marine life like fish, invertebrates, and birds. Impacts include decreased social bonding, failure to avoid predators, and suffering damage to hearing cells. Noise from seismic surveys can actually decrease the abundance of zooplankton, which is important because this disrupts the entire food chain, as many species depend on zooplankton for food. And while there's limited data, seabirds are also shown to be sensitive to both underwater and in-air sounds. So the Government of Canada released their draft ocean noise strategy at the end of the summer on August 23rd. The strategy has three themes. Theme 1 is science, knowledge gathering and innovation. Theme 2 is assessment and management. Theme 3 is communication, coordination, and engagement. And if you haven't already taken a look at the strategy, please do. I'll send a link in the chat. And the strategy intends to identify gaps and opportunities and issues surrounding ocean noise to minimize impacts to marine life. And it explores the ability of the government to work with multiple stakeholders and Indigenous nations for innovative solutions. This is a really great first step, and we are thrilled that we finally have a strategy. But it is lacking clear and actionable steps, timelines, and measurable outcomes. We need an actual enforceable plan if we hope to mitigate noise pollution and protect marine life across Canada. Okay, so that's enough of me talking. I will now introduce our first speaker, Kieran Cox, whose presentation title is Developing a Strategy to Regulation Action Plan. You may recognize Kieran from a WWF webinar earlier this year, which I will put a link to that in the chat too. Kieran is a Lieber Arrow and NSERC Fellow at Simon Fraser University. His research focuses on the nexus of aquatic pollutants, community ecology, and ecosystem management. Kieran and his collaborators are currently mapping vessel noise levels throughout British Columbia's exclusive economic zone examining how noise pollution interacts with changing coastal conditions and working to increase national awareness of these important topics. Kieran co-founded the Fish Sounds Project to document sound production in fishes, ensure non-mammalian taxa are included in noise pollution assessments, and facilitate engagement between researchers and the public. FishSounds.net is now the largest global inventory of siniferous fish diversity, cataloging the hums, grunts, and other sounds made by over 1,000 fish species. And I'll put a link to this in the chat as well. And Kieran, whenever you're ready, you can start sharing your presentation.
Fantastic, thank you. I always give too much away in those bios. You always like talk about what you're going to talk about. It's really funny. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Cool. I talk really fast, especially about things I get excited about. So feel free to tell me to slow down at some point if I miss anything. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm Kieran, and I'm going to be talking today about some of the work we've been doing to think about specifically how you would go from a strategy to a regulation action plan. And this research has been conducted on the Snuneymuxw, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations' unceded territory. And I'm very grateful to these nations for their continued stewardships of this land. I'd also like to thank all of those that make this work possible. And this is really just a small section of people that support this and ongoing projects that I'm associated with. They also make the work a lot of fun, which I think is probably the most important part. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders who are absolutely essential to the work that we're doing. They've been so supportive of all of our endeavors, and it would not be possible without them. So as mentioned, this is why many of you are here today. And while several aspects of this document are really important, I thought I'd just briefly touch on a few points of interest. One, for me, is that it has a guiding principle that states a whole ecosystem approach. It also stresses the need to address knowledge gaps and increase the strategic collection of data. It states we should be sharing data across federal departments and foster awareness through many stakeholder groups. And these are really driving principles of the work that my colleagues and I do, especially taking an ecosystem-wide approach. As really, for me, all of this work started in ecosystems. Specifically, I was a diver long before I was a scientist. And my favorite part of subtitle ecology has always been fishes. And when I became a marine ecologist, I became aware that fishes can use sound for exchanging information. And this has several advantages over visual systems due to light and color declining so rapidly with depth, but also chemical cues due to their less than predictable movement in the water. And we know that fishes are able to detect the information embedded in sound through several structures, one of which is shown here, the otolith, which in many ways is analogous to a human ear. They also can detect sound through the lateral line. Now, someone's thinking it, and they don't want to ask it in the chat, I'm sure, so I'll just talk on it directly. Fishes do not have external ears because of the consistency between tissue and water. And this allows sound to travel to the inner ear without the aid of an external structure. Now, fish use this hearing ability to detect a wide range of ocean sounds. But they also contribute to the soundscape through several mechanisms. For example, contracting a swim bladder, much like you would beat a drum. And we've looked into the reasons why fish create these types of sounds, seeing that under captive conditions, the majority of them are associated with stress, which is very understandable as being in captivity is stressful. However, under more natural conditions, we see that they're largely associated with reproduction, which is due to coordinating a spawning event, attracting a mate, other ways you might want to use sound related for reproduction. But how many fish are using these types of sounds or creating them? Well, really, we thought of this as a fundamental question in bioacoustics. It's really analogous to like how many species of bird are there, how many species of fish. It's really foundational. And so when we approached this, we had to first split it up. thinking about active sounds, those that are produced intentionally, which we would say are actively soniferous, and passive sounds, those that are the byproduct of an activity. And so to answer this question, a PhD student at the University of Florida, now postdoc at the University of Victoria, Audrey Luby, extracted data from over 900 sources of literature. And when we look across fish phylogeny, what we see shown here, and I know this is a bit much, but we'll work through it. Blue is all the fishes in the world, 34,000 species, give or take. And the black lines are every time a species is actively soniferous. And the take home here is it's taxonomically widespread. Oh, sorry, my Zoom just said that thing. Taxonomically widespread. Specifically, it occurs in over 130 families of fishes, and as previously mentioned, over 900 species. And these species are globally distributed. They occupy every climatic zone and water classification that FishBase, the leading authority on this topic, designates. And when we look into northern latitudes, like where many of you are right now, we actually see that there's an elevated abundance relative to the number of species in the region that are using sound. And we figure this is because when water is really dark, visual cues are even less useful. And so more species are likely to make sound. Now, because this is a living estimate, right? It's just a survey that's ongoing. People are constantly documenting which fish are making which sound. We launched the Fish Sounds Project in 2021. And this consolidates all of the existing information we can find on this topic. And through additional rounds of data collection, we've been able to expand our estimate. So now we know that there's over 1,000 species of fish that produce sound. And this includes links to the 1,300 recordings we have of these sounds. So go check out fishsounds.net. Your favorite species is probably on there. Play the sound. It's a really fun website to interact with. There's also many new tools that we're adding constantly. But we're focused on a little bit more local region today. So I thought I'd touch on the species in our waters that are using sound. So to do this, we can basically take FishBase, which documents fish globally, and fish sounds, and smash these data sets together, for lack of a better term. And when we do that, we see that there's 74 species in the Pacific Northeast that are actively producing sound. Now, by and large, the majority of these species are rockfish. But we also can't forget about sculpins, salmon, and greenling. And these sounds that they're making range, right? So many of you might know the midshipman who hums for hours on end at nighttime. Salmon make combinations of sounds, and herring make a fast, repetitive tick, which has been effectively named a fart. And so this is all part of our soundscape. Now, the cacophony of biological sounds that Fish Sounds has been documenting do not exist in isolation, right? These species are contending with multiple and ever-expanding sources of noise pollution. And so we really want to know what the impacts of this are. And when we examine how fish respond to anthropogenic noise using a meta-analysis, this allows us to consider a range of species and experimental conditions. And so we can do this by plotting the response category along the x-axis and the magnitude of the response along the y. And this means that if the data falls above the line, represents an increase, below the line, a decrease. And so, for example, we can say that we know with quite a bit of confidence, that fish exposed to anthropogenic noise are going to forage less often. They're also going to spend more time moving around, and they have an increased cost of reproduction, which is already one of the most costly things the species can do. They're going to have an increased hearing threshold, which indicates that they become temporarily deaf to certain frequencies and decibels. And these stressors are going to be registered within their blood cortisol level. Now, fishes are not the only taxa influenced by aquatic soundscapes, and including invertebrates in this dialogue is really essential, as they're the vast majority of species in the ocean. And so using a similar framework, Haley Davies, a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria, has recently determined that Much like fishes, anthropogenic noise and synthetic noise can have impacts to their behavior and their physiology. And she's also determined that specifically, we're going to see invertebrates moving much less often. They're going to be less able to engage in defense-related behaviors, and this can have impacts for their biochemistry and even their genetics. So a question with this work is always, how prevalent are these impacts, right? We can document this in the lab, we can show it experimentally, but it's a big coast. And so after 2 years of noise modeling, we've now determined what the soundscape of the coast was like before the Industrial Revolution. So specifically wind and wave noise shown here. And when you look at this, you see that it really sits around 70, 80 decibels. We've also determined what the coast sounds like on average and what the maximum noise levels within any given cell are. And this yields a 50 decibel increase from pre-industrialization across the entire coast. Now, many regions are going to be much higher than this. This is a coastal average. But just to give you a little context there, 50 decibels is the difference between a typewriter and a rock concert. So quite a large change in our soundscape. And this is an ongoing analysis, and we're working through every region, 14 different types of vessel classes, several depths and frequencies. And thanks to support from the CDOC Society and the Salish Sea Institute, we're now able to integrate species thresholds into this to determine where salmon, killer whales, and herring are most likely to be impacted and to what extent. But the question is, what can we do in the interim, right? That's going to take a while. So one of the ways to think about this is to ask what siniferous fishes are listed under SARA and COSIWIC, because we know without a doubt these species are contributing to and interacting with the soundscape. And after reviewing over 200 species recovery plans and other documents, we could extract information such as, is a species siniferous? Does it have a consideration for anthropogenic sound in its recovery plan? And is there any mention of its soundscape being a habitat characteristic that needs to be conserved? Through this, we were able to determine that of the 122 fishes that COSIWIC has assessed and the 38 that Sarah has listed, 25 and 4 of them are siniferous, equating to roughly 25 and 10% of the species. Now, unfortunately, few, if any, documents mention their sinifery or the use of the soundscape. And again, the majority of these species that are being listed are rockfish that occur locally here, but there's also 11 other families of fishes represented. Now, pulling this all together, we can examine the species that COSIWIC considers, those which Sarah has listed, which I'm sure as many of you are aware, the reason species aren't getting listed does have something to do with economics and conservation implications. We can also consider if the soundscape is noted in their recovery plan or other document, their sinifery status has been listed or not, anthropogenic stressors are included, and of these is noise pollution in this. Now, this might seem a bit dire because there's not a lot of dark blue on here, but actually I'm quite excited about this because really, to me, the more this can turn dark blue, the better we're doing at integrating soundscape into the conservation of Canadian species. So I see this as a real roadmap to doing a good job. But again, what can we do in the interim? This will take time. Well, there are some actions that I think are really worth considering. Specifically, some of you maybe saw this in the news not too long ago. And this stems from a report that was commissioned by the Department of Defense that I accessed through a Freedom of Information request. And one of the main reasons I was interested in this is because Species at Risk Act, Ocean Act, any other policy in Canada, or any other act in Canada, sorry, D&D is going to be exempt from that. So, southern resident killer whales, we can't impact them in the following way. There will be an exemption in that says military activity, public safety do not apply to this discussion. That's very worth being aware of when you think about why they had to do this or did do this, right? And means they did it. So they didn't have to commission this, they didn't have to look into it. And so I thought this was really interesting because it's kind of analogous to the state that our regulation is in Canada today. We don't have a lot to point to, and they went and did it. So I read this 300-page document several times, to say the least. And the report really just proposes that the acoustic impacts from munitions training can be classified using a diagram like this. So permanent hearing loss very close in red, temporary hearing loss in orange, masking in yellow. By the way, thanks for the definition of masking. It's always really nice when someone gives that beforehand. And behavioral impacts, and then onto audible. And these impacts can be mitigated by setting safe minimum distances. And so this is basically what it looks like. For an example of a marine mammal on the surface, you would need to be 220 meters away, while underwater, it would be 28 meters away to avoid temporary hearing loss. And these distances can be put in concurrently with other mitigation measures, ranging from radar to reporting, which will further reduce the likelihood of impacts. Now, like certainly this is a very hopeful approach in some regards, but there are several things that they did miss. They didn't evaluate masking in great detail, which is certainly possible given what we know today. They also didn't include non-mammalian taxa, which are the reason that many of these mammals are in the region to begin with. And they forgot about vessel-generated noise. That's kind of a big one. When you're firing a small arms munition from a 130-meter vessel, you need to consider the noise made by the vessel. And so we wrote this up, and you know what, honestly, this is really interesting because D&D actually, several folks agreed with us, and they reached out from the department. We've chatted about it. They said, these are very fair. Let's talk about how we move forwards. And so that's been really exciting because we have to kind of mitigate this and we have nothing to point to. And so I think there's a few things that I'd like to summarize from a report like this. One, that the precautionary principle, halting an activity, gathering your data, and then deciding what to do about it is extremely rare when we think about pollutants. There is no regulatory framework currently for many folks having to do this, let alone D&D. And so I think that's a good example to point to. I think this can be improved for military and other activities. And if you're going to do that, vessel noise and non-mammalian taxa are important to include. So normally I'd finish with a summary of some kind, but instead I decided to pose a bit of a question. Underwater noise, right? Is it a pollutant? Is it a contaminant? Is it a substance? These definitions really matter when we think about regulation. According to the Environmental Protection Act, contaminants are substances that cause harm. A substance is organic or inorganic matter, so noise pollution does not fall into that. As a result, the National Contaminant Advisory Group does not consider noise to be a contaminant, and this really matters from a policy perspective. So currently, underwater noise is none of these things in Canada. And when thinking about this in a lot more detail, I did notice this in the Environmental Protection Act. And the really important point here is energy. And so noise and sound is just vibrational energy underwater. And so really, I think certainly the question is an important one. To what extent do we even consider this a pollutant in Canada? But I think as we move forwards, thinking more about this and specifically of this energy statement is a way in to kind of getting a listing is really important to be aware of. So again, I'd like to thank all of those who support the work that I do, especially all the time we spend in the field, the generous funders who make all of this possible, those who steward the lands that I live, work, and play. If you want to reach out to me, this is how you do it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kieran. That was really insightful. And just as a reminder to our attendees that we will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. So, but you can still put your questions in the Q&A box now, if you wish. Okay. All right. And now I'll introduce our second speaker, Catherine Fedorov, with the title, oh my gosh, with a presentation title, Underwater Noise Impacts on Aquatic Life. Catherine is a biologist for an engineering consultancy firm called Hatch, and prior to that, she worked with OceanWise in their outreach program, Ocean Bridge. Catherine completed her master's thesis in 2021, which focused on the impact of boat noise on freshwater fish. Her master's sparked an enthusiasm for underwater noise research and impacts. At Hatch, she has continued to focus on impacts to fish and mitigation efforts for large industrial projects. Okay, so floor is all yours, Catherine.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will share my screen. Oh, I had to press another button. All right, is it showing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, my name is Catherine, and I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics, underwater noise. And it's not moving forward. Oh, there we go. Always does that to me. So I got involved deeper, as you mentioned, in my master's in 2018 when I started that, and I focused on how boat noise impacts freshwater fish. So I'm going to go over one of my experiments as I think it'll help us learn a little bit more about the complex relationship noise has with water. So before I continue, I do want to address most of my research is on freshwater, and obviously we are here for an ocean noise strategy. A lot of the anthropogenic noise studies started in the ocean, and that marine setting remains dominant with the research. But BC has a lot of unique animals that spend time in both freshwater and marine systems. So although I'm adding that freshwater perspective, a lot of the lessons learned can be applied to both systems. Also throughout the presentation, there's going to be like little footnotes that has some of the 20 recommendations that is listed within the ocean noise strategy. And that's just to kind of bring it back and to that relevance of why we're all here. So for one of the experiments that I conducted in my master's research was looking at how boat noise at different distances impacts fish behavior. So unlike marine settings where the water is sometimes turquoise and crystal clear, freshwater is often very turbid, and so it's difficult to observe fish behavior. Therefore, I used oxygen consumption to understand the overall stress levels of yellow perch, which was my study organism, a common fish throughout North America. And it is also considered a hearing generalist, and I will get onto that a little bit more later in the presentation. So in summary, the objective was to see how yellow perch's metabolic rate or change in oxygen consumption is impacted by boat noise at different distances. And it has been assumed that a change in metabolic rate or oxygen consumption can signify stress levels in fish. So this experiment was done a far way away from where we're talking about, the Georgia Strait, in Saskatchewan, where I was born and raised. In Lake Diefenbaker. So yellow perch were collected via seine net and starved for 20 hours before the experiment to reduce inter-individual differences due to recent in metabolic rate due to recent digestion. So after 20 hours, we placed the fish into a darkened plastic tube that was filled with aerated water. After sealing the tube, we measured the dissolved oxygen before sealing the tube and placing it into a white bucket that was weighted down with sand and submerged into the lake around 10 meters away from shore. So fish were exposed to one of four distances, 100, 250, 500, or 1,000 meters away from the boat, as well as our control, which was just the ambient lake noise. The boat had a 9.9 horsepower motor, and we used two different hulls that were both had that kind of V-shaped position, and that was just so that we knew the fish was responding to the motor noise and not something funky with the hull. So we tried to get around 30 fish per treatment with 20 for our control or ambient noise. So the white buckets were placed at each of the four distances. At each, when we had a trial or a noise testing period, we had 6 of those darkened tubes in the white bucket. 5 of them contained fish and 1 just contained lake water, but we measured pre-dissolved oxygen, and post-dissolved oxygen in that as well, and I'll explain why in a second. So fish were exposed for 20 minutes. We measured the dissolved oxygen before and after, as well as we weighed the fish after the experiment. So before we can kind of analyze the results, we did account for the length of time the fish was in the jar. This was just me sprinting down a beach trying to get to the fish in 20 minutes time. So sometimes it went over. The weight of the fish and the oxygen consumed by the bacteria in the water. So that's where that empty jar was for. We really wanted to make sure that we were capturing the oxygen consumed by the fish and not because I dunked the jar into a really eutrophic water. So our results, you're seeing, if I find my mouse, oxygen consumed in percentage, as well as our 5 noise treatments, our control, 100, 250, 500, and 1,000 meters away from the boat. As you can see, all distances between the sound source and the test subject resulted in greater oxygen consumption. Even at a kilometer away, fish were more stressed compared to the control, which I think really illustrates how widespread and dangerous this pollutant can be, and that species will lack the shelter they need. So I did this experiment, it showed that fish get stressed out by noise. And I'm going to give a little bit of background onto that and kind of also what I do at Hatch and how it relates into regulations. So as Kaylee mentioned, noise pollution is quickly increasing, but is one of the least studied anthropogenic disturbances. And some of the common activities that produces these noise, as we heard, is pile driving, explosives use near water, overall increased vessel operations from projects, as well as oil and gas operations. So again, as we heard, there's a really unique relationship between noise and water. You can travel between 4 and 5 times faster in water compared to air and has lower attenuation, so it can be heard several kilometers away from the source. And due to this, it is predicted that many aquatic species may lack the shelter they need from this pollutant. So I'm going to give a little brief introduction to some sound properties. I'm not a physicist, so hopefully this goes okay. When sound travels through water, the kinetic energy is imparted into the water particles, and the sound travels as a propagated longitudinal elastic wave. You can see it on the presentation. So essentially what this means is as noise travels through water, it excites that water particle, and then as it moves back, the water particle returns to normal. So when we're talking about fish hearing, there are 2 phrases that are important. First one is particle motion. So when we say a fish can detect particle motion, we are referring to the displacement, velocity, and acceleration of the particle in the sound wave as the noise travels and changes in water. The ability to detect particle motion can give fish some directional information as to where the sound is coming from. The second term is sound pressure, and this simply describes the frequency characteristics or intensity of the sound. So air to water transmission of sound is an important issue when we're talking about some projects that are within the marine or freshwater environment, but outside. So like wind farms or explosives near water. Now this is its own science and lots of theories, but essentially all we need to know is that air to water transmission is extremely low with an impedance factor of 1 out of 3,600. Now this can depend some factors such as the angle, how calm the water is, as well as depth. And some of this lesson will come back when we talk about some mitigation. So Kieran gave an excellent intro into some fish hearing, and I'm going to dive a little bit more into it. So there is major variation among fish species in terms of their hearing, but there is a basic ear structure, which includes the semicircular canals, the anterior, posterior, and horizontal, their respective sensory cristae, and the 3 otolith organs that are the sacula, lagina, and utricle, as well as the sorry, those were the organs in the otoliths, the lapillus, sagitta, and astericus. So sensory hair cells can be found on both the cristae and all of the otolith organs. And depending on the size of the fish, there can be hundreds upon thousands of these. So this is the most basic ear structure. However, there's been a lot of evolution in terms of this. So when sound hits fish, the fish and the inner ear move with the same density as the sound of the particle motion. This phenomenon occurs because the fish is of similar density to the surrounding water. However, the otoliths are not. They have a higher density, and therefore when that sound hits the fish, it creates this type of shearing force. And this is applied to the sensory epithelium and the hair cells. So this is the most basic form, but there are some hearing specialists that have some unique structures, such as the Weberian ossicle. And this is found in the superorder Ostereophysi, so like carps, minnows, catfish, and this allows them to detect a broader range of frequencies, and so that they might be more vulnerable to noise. So when we're talking about noise pollution, it is more unique compared to chemicals and metals because it is difficult to determine an endpoint as where a fish, dies or we see potential mortal injury. So a lot of scientists go towards behaviors. And some of the behaviors that have been observed to change due to chronic noise exposure is shoaling, communication, as Karen had talked about, mutualism, foraging, anti-predator defenses, as well as reproduction. However, a lot of this has been done within marine system, and freshwater data are rare. So leading us back to underwater noise regulations, majority of the concern when it comes to projects with an increase in underwater noise is a concern over the physical damage and mortality of aquatic species. So of course, mortality or potential mortal injuries found in fish that are exposed to impulsive sound can cause all of these physical damages, as well as the temporary auditory threshold change. So like when you go out to a concert, and you come out, you can't hear anything, that's something that fish can experience too, but it is more difficult to assess. So as Karen had mentioned, there's not a lot of regulatory pathways for when proponents and large projects have in-stream or in marine works. There's potential for that sound pressure to reach that injury threshold that we saw, so where some of these symptoms and mortalities might occur. So it's really important for proponents to understand what level of sound is being produced by such as pile driving or explosives that can potentially cause mortality. I've put a little table here with some of the sound pressures that have that are recommended as of right now in terms of what we want to see. And so we have fish without swim bladder, fish with swim bladder, and eggs and larvae. And these are often found in the literature from past projects, as well as the guidelines for the use of explosives in or near Canadian fisheries waters. All right. So when we have a project that needs to occur within marine or in stream, and that sound might reach that injury threshold where there might be mortality or mortal injuries, there needs to be mitigation measures in place. And one of the main ones is bubble curtains. So as we saw in the previous slide, it is really important. It is really hard for sound to go from water into air or air to water. And with bubble curtains, it surrounds the sound source, and the noise has to go from water to air and back to water. So it really dilutes and dissipates it. And at some of the projects that I have worked on have been in estuaries or rivers. So we need to account for that flow rate. And if it disperses the bubbles too much, that sound pressure might reach critical levels. So some of the cool things that we do that I get to be a part of at Hutch is modeling these scenarios, and some of the things that we need to understand in order to figure out a safe mitigation measure is understanding the aquatic organisms around us for their injury thresholds, the bathymetry, the general bed conditions, the type of equipment used. So some pile driving, actually, depending on the equipment, they're all different and they can produce less or more noise, as well as the location and the water conditions. And so all of these really show how complex underwater noise can be and all the considerations that we need to consider. Another important thing is to engage with local communities and First Nations, as they can provide a lot of important traditional knowledge that will allow more protection in terms of the aquatic organisms. So ending the presentation on coming back to that Canada's ocean noise strategy. Obviously, coming from freshwater system, how much did I expect to see fish or freshwater represented in an ocean noise strategy? Not much. So I can only be disappointed. You know, I get it. It's called ocean noise strategy, but I guess I wanted it to be called aquatic noise strategy, allowing and opening that door to have some regulatory pathways for freshwater. But one of the pros in it is they really emphasize finding best practices and standardized methodologies, which really will help regulatory pathways and proponents in understanding what they need to do to protect aquatic organisms in all senses. So thanks so much for allowing me to come and talk about my favorite topic. And looking forward to your questions and the rest of the presentation, but feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk a little bit more. And I will stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That was excellent. There we go. I'll introduce our third speaker, Fred, the Orca Man, whose presentation title is The Ecosystem of Noise Reporting and Your Place in It. Fred is an educational creator out of Vancouver, BC, focusing on connecting people to the orcas in their local waters and around the world. By engaging his audience with research, current events, and resources to connect people to the species physically, he encourages people to engage with their curiosity, explore the natural world, and get them excited about this awe-inspiring species. Great. Take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to both Kieran and Catherine for coming before me. This is a lot of great research that you both are doing, and it's incredibly important, especially too when thinking about all of the things we're talking about today. So thank you both for that. I am coming in from Vancouver, so I'll be presenting, and a lot of my work is done in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And the thing that I wanted to come on and talk about today, I'm not doing research by any means, but I do have a lot of knowledge and experience in noise reporting and understanding of kind of what that system looks like with regard to cetaceans here in BC, and in some light, also Washington State, as this is a very cross-border area, and a lot of these problems do require things in both areas. So to start out, I actually just wanted to start with the local sightings that I've seen to kind of give you an idea about how urban a lot of these populations of cetaceans are. And as we've been talking a lot about fish, to think about how close kind of connected these ecosystems are to the places that we work, play, recreate, love, and want to care for. So every image of a killer whale and a humpback that you see there was not seen on a whale watch boat. That is seen either from land or one of the ferries as we were going through. Now, in each of these instances, in trying to convince you of how urban these killer whales are, I wanted to start with a story of the most urban kind of experience that I've had with them, which was just this past September, when myself and one of my friends heard that there was orcas going down by Deep Cove and making their way west. We crossed the second Narrows and we're trying to see them over by Deep Cove, but at that point in time they'd moved on. And then we actually saw them just from shipyards. And so if anybody's been to Canada Place and taken the sea bus, they literally swam right by that path. This is also to the Port of Vancouver is not that far over in these areas. And so you have a lot of cargo ships that are moving through this area, and as well cruise ships, which is one of the biggest ports in Vancouver of cruise ships in the world. And so, in fact, it was just after a cruise ship went through the narrows here just underneath the Lionsgate Bridge that we saw the 4 orcas come up. These were transient killer whales, ones who eat seals, but with this and the proximity to the ships around, one of the things that me and my friends were very on top of as we were doing this was trying to report the locations of the whales so that they could then be followed and alerted to any of the captains in the area. Another instance that I wanted to point out of the urban populations of killer whales that we have is back in 2019, they actually went up into False Creek. If anybody's been to Vancouver, you have been in the water where killer whales are, and you want to keep a lookout next time. They, in fact, hunted while they were within this creek. You can see a little aquabus in the background. Brittany was told to stop at that point just to give them the space they needed to explore what they needed, have a little bit of lunch at Gravel Island, and continue on their way. But this is really just to explain that you can be involved and see, these cetaceans to begin with anywhere along BC's coastline. And so you want to be keeping your eyes out to begin with. But by doing that, you can also be an extreme help for them. Now, I wanted to bleed into another story about their echolocation and communication in general, as orcas are very acoustic animals. This past September, I also got the chance to stay on the west side of San Juan Island with some friends, and there is a hydrophone there that's run by a bunch of people locally, and it is publicly accessible. You can have it on all the time. You guys can turn it on right now if you wanted to and hear the live sounds from this area. Now, we didn't see killer whales for a few days that we were there. We luckily had 6, but there was one evening where we were able to catch them on the hydrophone. It was about 11 p.m. at night, and we could walk out and hear them going. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but this is a post by one of my friends that I went with, Kendra Nelson, who caught and recorded the sounds that were from there. So I'm going to give this a shot. This is a warning for anybody who has their headphones on or their volume loud before I press it. There's 2 other kind of soundscape things I want to put on later, but I'm just giving you a fair warning. 3, 2, 1. So that's very exciting. And for us, especially too, being there, we are big fans of the Southern residents. We always want to see them as they're the endangered population of killer whales around here. They've been mentioned before. It's one of the key focuses of the Georgia Strait Alliance, which we also greatly appreciate. And so on that front, being able to see, check up on them is of great importance. And so to hear all of them, this is actually was understood to be populations, or a greater majority of them, so at least 60% of them, I believe, were present for this passing as they were making their way south and then out to the Georgia Strait. But using these hydrophones, we're not only able to listen to the orcas, but also to any of the vessels going by, so you can kind of have an idea yourself of what that looks like, and also to allows anybody listening to them to be able to communicate that information to the vessels that are traveling through Harrow Strait, which I'll show you as one of the more heavily trafficked ones within the Salish Sea, to be able to mitigate those noise wherever we can. And so I mentioned
Sorry,
before, like I
Fred.
said, yeah,
Could
what's
I
up?
just interrupt? I don't think that video played. I'm not sure if it was just on my end, but
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry for the little silence then. I will
yeah,
send the video in another thing.
yeah, thank you.
No, absolutely. That's a good thing to know for the following ones, or one following thing that I have as well. On that front though, with this, like I said, we went down to go see these orcas and try to see the population, check in on how they were doing, and we were lucky enough. I'm going to ask you to see if this video plays for you. To come across one mother and her brand new calf. It's playing on mine, but I want to make sure. Put it back.
It's a bit laggy, but it is playing.
Okay, I'll try to pause it then where you can see the little one. So we were able to come across one of the females in the pod with her very first calf. This is L90 Biana, and this little one was named L128. This is an alphanumeric system that we use for our southern resident killer whales. And so we were able to see a few different passes of these two, and they were looking fairly healthy at the time. I believe this was September 16th that we saw them as they were going through, and there was various research organizations nearby trying to keep tabs on both of these whales, trying to determine their health and the ways in which we could potentially help set them up for success. Now, these orcas specifically, in difference than the transient killer whales, use echolocation primarily to search for their food. They can be very loud. As much as the fish can hear them, they are able to find and share food together. And that is one of the greatest kind of threats within them, is not only the source itself, but the ability to find, which we're talking about today. So, like I said, echolocation is primarily used for these resident killer whales who are looking for food. And what we know that after the first two presentations, the acoustic impact has effects on fish. It also has impacts for the orcas to find fish. And so there's many levels of this, many trophic levels and many, various levels of species that are affected in both their individual aspects and interconnectedness on that, as orcas also communicate with each other, which you will hear in the one coming soon. So southern resident killer whales specifically, we want to focus on those, especially too with the Georgia Strait and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, which is just at the bottom here, because a lot of their prey and a lot of their hunting that we've seen around this area is largely honed into very specific areas within. Now, we were on the west side of San Juan Island. That's where I took that video there, and where we were able to hear on the hydrophone that is just on the side there. So we see that's one of the very heavily frequented areas. And then this up here is Vancouver, and then the Fraser River coming out in both ends. And so you'll see there's a lot of frequency of orcas there, or southern residents specifically there as well, and then just on the outside as they're moving through. And so understanding the frequency allows us to highlight the key areas where we know these animals to be in any instance, and so even more so, even further, able to create mitigating plans to try and give them as much space, both physically and acoustically, as humanly possible. And so I can send this as well. I'm not going to play with the times, but you can actually hear the difference in decibels that the reduced speed has within these areas. It's one of the large kind of productions that is both within the ocean noise strategy and something that is currently being done in various initiatives by both the Fraser Point of Vancouver, Transport Canada, and other agencies. And the reduced speed definitely opens up a wider space for all of these animals to exist, play, hunt, and socialize in within the acoustic landscape. And so those differences of just even reducing speed by half during these very key areas can make monumental differences in what these animals are able to exist in and do. So this is where I wanted to highlight the Enhancing Cetacean Habitat and Observation Program by the Port of Vancouver, as they have for the past 5 years now, so since 2019, been working in conjunction with a few different organizations to work with vessels within the area. Like I said, this is a Port of Vancouver program to alert vessels to orcas and other cetaceans within the area to reduce speeds. And as they do this, in reducing speeds in any of these instances also helps the rest of the ecosystem as they're going through. So this is one area where you can kind of expand that further. So the way that the whale report alert system works, this is a system that would be held by tugboat operators, by large commercial vessels that are moving in back and forth. This is by the Washington State Ferry System, the BC Ferry System, and cruise ships that are making their way through any of these instances. So there's two different ways that the whale report alert system can be enacted because they're on the water and not always accessible. There are always operators that are in communication with these vessels that have desktop accessibility to these reports. And then once they have these reports, there is regulations voluntary to a large extent, but largely followed as well, which is great for both noise and speed recommendations through these areas if they're within a 10-mile radius of any cetacean. Now, beyond that, there's also phone apps that each of these captains can hold individually, so that if they don't have somebody that they're directly operating with, there is that other avenue for them to explore. Now, the cool thing about this is that it's not just the researchers on the water or these large organizations that are highlighting some of these reports, but it is also the public. So A lot of this information is crowdsourced. We have a very, very, very robust sightings network of people up and down the coast of Washington and British Columbia that are looking out every day to see where these whales are to be able to report them so that we can try to keep them as safe as humanly possible, like I said. And like I mentioned before, with the urban orcas that I alone have seen and humpbacks to that extent over the past year, you never know when you're going to come across one, whether it be on a ferry ride, whether it be walking along the seawall one afternoon, or driving down the coast and you spot a blow down the way. And so the one big kind of push that I'd have for anybody here, besides reading the ocean noise strategy, trying to contribute any other thoughts you have to it, is to also download the Whale Report app, to have it in your phone and ready if and when you see a whale, because in the areas that we are, it is never not a option that will happen. And so being as prepared as we can is going to be the greatest kind of setup we could have for it. Just wanted to highlight some of the initiatives that the ECHO program has had outside of this Whale Report app. So there's 3 specifically. The first is the Harrow Strait Voluntary ship slowdown. So like I said, around here is where we saw the mother and her calf. And so this is a very, very key area, like I said, for those southern resident orcas to have and to know for last year, at least, that there is a lot of participation, and the slowdown has greatly reduced the sound intensity within this area. Those are great steps in the right direction, and the more people we have and looking, and the more proof we have of the benefits, the better we can make this happen. Now, it's not just ships slowing down necessarily that we can change, but a large part of this as well is where the ships are going. So the Strait of Juan de Fuca is between the southern part of Vancouver Island and the northern part of Washington. So this is Vancouver Island here, and the Olympic Peninsula in Washington here. So another avenue that they're trying to enact is changing the directions or the locations and shipping lanes for tug vessels and other vessels as they're moving along, to give this space close to the shoreline, which is more critical to a lot of these creatures, more space. So one part of this, of course, is the sound reduction itself, and then the other half is the space from these animals, because more space will allow for greater kind of avenues within. So there is definitely a multifaceted approach. And then this is one other instance just at the end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this is, again, Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula down here, and then opening out into the Pacific Ocean as any animals will be coming in, trying to then divert these vessels into the deepest kind of parts so that we can allow for any entrances on the other side to be a little bit clearer. So before I begin to finish up, I just wanted to highlight a few organizations that are pretty important in understanding and visualizing both the soundscape and also to on-water patrolling, because we have these big conversations about large vessels that are definitely producing a whole bunch of sound all the time, but there are also pleasure boaters who are not looking out as consistently. And so in order for education for all of our people on the water, as well as enforcement and research, BC Whales and Orca Sound are 2 hydrophone networks. BC Whales naturally in British Columbia, and Orca Sound largely within the States, but it is definitely a cross-country collaboration there. The Be Whale Wise is an education organization and conservation organization. Otherwise, the idea is to provide boaters with the knowledge of the current regulations in the United States and Canada for whale watching and reporting as well. And then Straight Watch and Sound Watch are organizations in Canada and the United States, respectively, who are working on that on-water enforcement and education for any vessels that are properly there. They're also helping a lot with reporting on that front. My one final takeaway for you, like I said, is the Whale Report app is incredibly important and useful for you to be able to highlight and report any of these instances, to literally slow a ship down by reporting yourself in something that you saw with regard to any cetaceans around. That doesn't mean just orcas, humpbacks, gray whales, minke whales all count on those fronts. And I have a land-based whale watching guide if you want to go actively seek these whales out from land, both in BC and Washington. So if you want to go out and go explore these areas a little bit more and kind of be a part of the plan to reduce noise within the area, that is definitely a thing worth doing. Just want to say thank you again to the Georgia Strait Alliance for setting this up. Thank you to the two speakers before me. It's very informative, and I have a few questions of my own that I'll hold until after. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much, Fred. And thanks again to all three of the speakers today for sharing your expertise and work on ocean noise. It's so great to see like all the passion that each of you bring to addressing these issues in very different ways. So thanks again. And I'll just share my screen again. I think I would be better at this by now. And one of the reasons we wanted to host a webinar was also to inform everybody that there is a consultation period that is open for the public to provide feedback on the ocean noise strategy. And it is only open until October 22nd, which is just 6 days away. So, you know, get on that if you haven't already. It's a really great opportunity for everybody, particularly Indigenous peoples, marine industry stakeholders, non-government and environmental organizations, and the general public to ask questions, provide feedback and suggestions. I will also link our toolkit. You can find it, well, in the chat box or on our website, and it can help you formulate some thoughts on your feedback if you wish. We really encourage everybody to comment on the strategy, no matter how small or large this feedback is. These comments will contribute to the federal action plan, which the first draft is anticipated to come out in 2025. So please make your voice heard. And just some additional resources. These are some other organizations in BC and across Canada that focus on ocean noise pollution. WWF Canada, Marine Education Research Society, OceanWise, BC Whales, Clear Seas, and more. WWF in particular has an awesome campaign, #LessNoise, to support a strong ocean noise strategy. And MERS as well has an Ocean Voices campaign. Both of these campaigns you can find in the chat box. My Tilly will put in those links. And lastly, what can you do as an individual to help mitigate noise pollution? Slowing down when operating boat vessels and maintaining your distance if you see any mammals nearby. Using the whale warning flag, which is a yellow and red flag with a whale tail on it, to warn others about whales nearby. There's also a link on this that Be Whale Wise has a lot of information, so put that in the chat as well. And being mindful of what we buy. We can reduce the need for cargo ships by choosing to buy less and buying more locally. Educating one another about underwater noise pollution impacts. So, you know, everyone here today, go tell everyone that you know what you learned today in the webinar. And choosing land-based whale watching over boat tours, and of course, making your voice heard in the public consultation survey. Okay, and that brings us to the end of this webinar. We have about 15 minutes. So if you haven't already, I know Kieran's been answering some questions. So now's the time to put your questions in the chat box. And if we don't have time to get to your question, or if you think of something after the webinar, please email us at gsa@georgiastrait.org, and we will get back to you. Okay, so I can see that there is some more questions here. Maitili, do you want to start saying them out?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So seems like there's a couple of questions. Maybe we can just go one by one. So the first question is posed by Anna. There are so many blasts going off the Juan de Fuca Strait, almost daily and multiple. I believe it's due to the military base. Is there any movement on this to greatly reduce their occurrence?
I can answer that one. Yeah, so I don't know specifically if that would be the military, and that's worth being aware of because pile driving will be very consistent. And so if it's like a daily consistent noise, and it's especially if it's operating during daylight hours, I would say it's worth considering if it's construction of a pile driving, because that will travel very great distances. Like for example, that's pretty similar to gunfire as a noise source. So that would be worth knowing. If it is the military, then they do have a marine mammal program that looks at mitigating impacts. So there's probably folks thinking about it, but at the same time, their activity does relate to national security. And so they're exempt from any existing regulation, as which folks have pointed out there's pretty minimal, but any future regulation will also have exemptions. So, it's kind of this issue that I think kind of politically is a tough one, which is like, when national security is on the line, where does conservation fall? And so that's kind of that conversation. I've certainly found D&D. I wrote that paper, right? I accessed that through a Freedom of Information request, which basically means I sent in as a Canadian citizen, I have a right to information, so give it to me. And they did. It was a little bit stressful because you are asking the Department of Defense for information, but I found them really great to talk to about the issue. Once we published the paper and they saw the media, they were like, "Yep, let's chat. Very fair. Let's talk more about how we could integrate these things." So yeah, they were far more progressive in the conversation than I thought kind of many other sectors would be. So yeah, you could also try to reach out to them as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kieran. Moving on to the next question. Whale watching vessels are a source of noise pollution. They move in at high speeds, then follow for a long time, then speed away. Many vessels following from morning to evening light. This is a source of noise that could be eliminated. Why is it still allowed?
I think that I might be able to speak to this question more specifically, and it's a great point, especially too, as like we do have this industry where we are bringing vessels closer to these animals intentionally, and so there's a lot of both one regulation that occurs within, and then the other is kind of conservation and efforts of reporting. So the first thing that I'll say for that is there are regulations with regards to which whales are allowed to be watched. And so that is both between the United States and Canada. I mentioned earlier there's a distinction between two different kinds of orcas that we usually have in our waters. So this is the southern resident killer whales and the transient orcas. So the southern resident, there are 74 of those animals currently, and those are the fish eaters. So they use echolocation primarily to hunt for food. Now, that is greater in terms of a threat with regard to sound, whereas the transients or mammal eaters will be more inclined to use other senses as well as kind of collective communication to find those areas. They're also far, far, far more abundant with their numbers within British Columbia. And so both the whale watchers as well as the greater like communities of research and conservation around have understood the benefits that could come from engaging with people. Now, the other half of noise specifically and them staying from dawn till dusk, there are also regulations both within the United States and Canada for how long, specifically Washington and BC, a tour is able to stay with an animal. So if you go on a 5-hour tour that's out of Washington or British Columbia, you will find that if you do come upon cetaceans, there is a about hour window that they're allowed to stay with them in a 5-hour tour. So if you go and find killer whales, you're not staying with them the whole time, and if they are, that is not standard practice. So there are various mitigation techniques as well. A lot of these organizations are reporting, like I was mentioning, to the Whale Report app or the Whale Report alert system for larger vessels around, and acting as a barrier to some degree for pleasure craft that are also speeding through the areas able to provide information. So it's a very complicated kind of topic, but I hope that gives at least a little bit more clarity onto some of the restrictions that currently exist in the way that they're being utilized.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just had like a follow-up on that. So I've noticed like articles saying that southern residents have been spotted even more now, and they're being seen more and more, which I think is untrue. It is a misconception. So would you be just quickly be able to speak on like the differences and how we can just let go of this misconception basically? Because I've been coming across such articles recently.
Yeah, that's totally fair, and I'd be interested, especially too, if you find any, please share them with me, just to understand where a lot of this information is coming from. Because even when I talk to people, there's a notion of like killer whales are coming back to the area, and we do have a lot of transients around. I know when I posted I showed the like even just my sightings from land around Vancouver, those are all transient with the exception of northern resident killer whales, which usually aren't down this far. But southern resident orcas are not being seen nearly as much as they have in previous years by like large numbers. And you know, in their kind of frequencies of this area, it has definitely not been one in the numbers that it was used to be. Two, they're like a smaller population, so we're seeing fewer of them in any instance as well. So, like I said, even when we had the populations go by San Juan Island, it was like I said, 60% of the whole of that population. And so, while we might be seeing some instances of individual orcas more, which is also too, like I said, comparatively to numbers 10, 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, are starkly less. Having the information of them being around, people are definitely, we get excited about them because they are, as far as I understand, as far as to me and a lot of other people within the community, like one of the pillars within the Salish Sea ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a couple more questions and we are good on time. Ocean noise sounds awful for these sea critters. Kieran demonstrated what the ocean noise looked like pre-colonization and then after, both at an average soundscape and the heightened one. What would this ocean noise map look like if you had your dream legislated ocean noise strategy?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think it really gets at the reality of the situation. Like fundamentally, I'm a conservation biologist, and so I think that in the modern world means you have to be very realistic. And so, for me, I think noise is actually a really interesting pollutant in several regards, and I think we can capitalize on that. So what I mean specifically is noise is not additive, right? So if you have one boat in an area, 2, 3, 4, it's not the same if you have 1 liter of oil, then 2 liters of oil, 3 liters of oil, et cetera. It doesn't add up that way, right? And so if I had my ideal kind of map, it would be very defined shipping lanes. I think the idea of like just getting noise off the coast is not realistic. It also would do massive things to our quality of life, the economy. These things do have to be considered, but we can put vessels in specific areas. So I think you can look at where species occur, where they're using specific habitats, why they're using them. You can take that from a whole ecosystem approach, because I certainly understand the focus on whales, but they move around a lot and they go to specific areas for specific reasons. And so we don't consider the reason they're there, then you kind of lose some of that. So I think you can put really defined shipping lanes and areas of vessel traffic into specific areas. So that would be thick red lines in areas where species are less likely to occur or sensitive species don't occur at all. That would be great. I also think we can, and actually that's some of the work we're doing right now, right? So I mentioned this a little bit. We received funding from the Sea Doc Society, and I was awarded a Salish Sea Institute Fellows position. And these are just great. They're allowing us to map killer whale, salmon, and herring response thresholds onto that data. And I think that's really key for figuring out kind of the ecological implications of those noise maps, identifying priority areas, polluters, and these types of things. So I think, defined areas of noise. I think marine protected areas should be acoustic refugia. That's really fundamental to the point of protected areas. I also think it would deal with a lot of other pollutants that sneak in there. So noise is the byproduct of human activity. The idea behind a protected area is to reduce human activity. You can focus on 15 stressors, or you can focus on noise. I just think noise is really effective that way. That's another thing we're working on as well. So yeah, it would be pocketed amounts of noise. And then, yeah, certainly to the other question, there are ways to reduce noise in general. So we need to keep pushing on the shipping industry, which has been awesome for this, for quieter vessels, looking at props, looking at engines, looking at electric options. This will be a big route forwards as well. So yeah, we're not going to get noise off the coast, but I think we can control more about where it goes.
Thank you for that insight. We still have a couple of questions to address. So moving on. This one's for Catherine. Are the bubble walls or shields that Catherine mentioned in public, industrial use, or mostly just research? They seem really cool and something we could implement now.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. The bubble walls that I have been around has mostly been for industrial purposes, although I'm sure some researchers are looking into their effectiveness as well. So when we look at the bubble walls, um, we have hydrophones around the source that the noise is coming from. So in this case, pile driving. Pile driving can cause fish mortalities very suddenly. It, like Kieran said, it's like a gun blast. It can be very loud. And so we'll measure the sound pressure of, at different distances to see what thresholds would result for fish, for seals, for orcas, for any animal that's around the area. And sometimes one bubble curtain isn't enough. There have been projects that have had upwards of 6 bubble curtains around the source to make sure that that sound pressure doesn't get to a lethal point. And it is something that all proponents have to consider if their project will have some harm to fish. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Catherine. There's also just another question about the control in your experiment. Was there a fish in the bucket that was not subjected to any noise?
It's a great question. So our control was just to lake ambient noise. So it wasn't subjected to, there wasn't any fish that didn't get to hear nothing at all. We wanted kind of a natural one. And I do often also get the question of, you picked up the fish, put them in a dark tube, and then put them in another bucket. That sounds like a very stressful and traumatic experience. Of course, there's going to be a metabolic rate and stress, but our control was also subjected to the same stressful environment as the noise one. So that was something that we considered. And if I had gone on to a PhD, I probably would have had a fish listen to nothing at all. So great question.
Thank you so much for that. There's one really cute question that I think would be nice to address. So it says, "Hi, my name is Sophia and I am 10 years old and I love orcas. If I were swimming in the ocean, would I be able to hear whale sounds if they were close by, and how close?"
Yes, sorry about that. My mic was off. That is a great question, and the answer depends on the kind of whale to begin with. But I will say that the orcas that were swimming by when we picked them up on the hydrophone on the west coast of San Juan Island were within a mile away, and so if you are swimming within the water, there is a potential that you can hear them if they are about a mile away and vocalizing. So it is definitely possible. They don't need to be very close in order for you to pick up yourself, I don't believe.
Thank you for that. We do have a couple more questions, and I'm thinking with the interest of time, maybe we can just pass these questions on. Or folks who have sent us this message, if you could just send us an email, we'd be really happy to get back to you. Kelly, do you just want to take on the closing remarks?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maitili. Thanks everybody for the questions. And yeah, if we do think of something else, like just please let us know through email. And please join us on our social media if you haven't already, just to keep up to date on GSA's work. And as a reminder, there will be a recording of today's session sent out later if you would like to revisit any of it. And thank you so much just for joining us today, and to the 3 presenters, a huge thank you for sharing your expertise and all your insights. We really hope that everyone here learned something new today and that it inspires you to fill out that public survey. And just lastly, if you're able to the attendees, if you're able to, please consider donating to us if you enjoyed this webinar, just to ensure we can continue our work in protecting the Salish Sea. We also welcome any feedback on this webinar. It's our first one in a long time, so feel free to email us, but we will also have a feedback survey sent out later. So thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thanks for coming, everybody.